to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway.
A wave of political and social unrest is sweeping South America. But in the last 4 months, presumably stable countries have erupted, leaving death, anger, and political instability in their wake.
A very small elite, oligarchic elite, has held power, and it has done so with extreme violence through history. So that's part of Latin America's tradition. So when people rebel, they rebel violently.
First came Ecuador, where a steep rise in the price of fuel was the last straw. An uprising led by indigenous Ecuadorians brought the government to its knees. The biggest surprise has been Chile, considered an oasis of political stability and an economic model for the region. Anger over social inequality, demonstrations, human rights violations by security forces, looting and vandalism have brought the country to the verge of recession in less than 2 months. Here in Chile, the protests show no sign of abating. In fact, they are turning out to be an inspiration in other Latin American democracies, where dissatisfaction with the economy and the political status quo have long been simmering. Colombia, which has a similar free market economic system, is beginning to look like a copy of Chile, aggravated by already existing violence by drug traffickers, left and right-wing rebel groups, and a peace agreement with FARC rebels that has collapsed amid charges of government sabotage. The largely uncontrollable uprisings and the weak response from democratic governments threatens more than social order. Inequality isn't new, but what is a region-wide awareness that people of all social classes have rights to decent social services and salaries, to live in a democracy free of abuses and widespread corruption, and most of all, the right to take action. There's little doubt that credible political institutions and a recalibration of the region's economic priorities can't wait. Postponing them could have unforeseen consequences.
That was Lucia Newman reporting for Al Jazeera on December 2nd. The protests in Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina express the anger of working people with the oligarchic form of democracy imposed on them and the neoliberal austerity policies and crony capitalism that characterize their governments. Al Jazeera's Counting the Cost took a look at the protests against the government of Lenin Moreno in Ecuador and what triggered them.
Hello, I'm Kamal Santa Maria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Ecuador. It took a multi-billion-dollar loan from the IMF, but while the corporations got tax forgiveness, the poor got austerity. No wonder Ecuador's seen 2 months of protests. We look at how the government of Lenin Moreno seemingly got it so wrong. There is, right now, a rebellion in Latin America against inequality, austerity, and the politics of more of the same. It's not dissimilar to uprisings elsewhere, springing from what look like the most innocuous of changes. Think about Chile. We looked at it a few weeks ago, in fact, where the rise of train fares led to street protests, which then morphed into calls for an end to neoliberalism, the idea of leaving everything to the markets. And then there are the countries who went looking for help. In Argentina, a sitting president was voted out of power in a protest over austerity measures imposed by the International Monetary Fund. It was a condition of a $57 billion bailout. And in Ecuador, it was the IMF's involvement which forced the president and cabinet to escape the capital, Quito. Now, Ecuador is a fascinating case. It requested a $4.2 billion loan from the IMF, and a condition of that was to cut the budget deficit. So the government decided to cut the fuel subsidies, which were costing $1.3 billion a year. Now, by the numbers, it makes sense. But when you cut subsidies, people generally don't like it, and protests forced the government to walk back the proposal. But perhaps even more alarming is that the size of that bailout was also similar to the size of tax forgiveness, which was given to Ecuadorian corporations. Why would you do that? Why would you take a loan to help the corporations, but then cut subsidies to the poorest?
The poster child for neoliberal economics in Latin America is Chile. The Pinochet dictatorship, aided by the Chicago Boys, the acolytes of Milton Friedman who were brought in to reform the economy after the brief rule of socialist President Salvador Allende, introduced neoliberalism with its tax cuts for the wealthy and cuts in benefits for working people. This report from France 24 News highlights the current problems there.
This unprecedented violence in the country has really shook the international community as well as the Chileans. We haven't seen this, as you mentioned, since the dictatorship, but there are a lot of reasons that that began these mass demonstrations in the country that go before before the re-election of President Piñera. We have Chileans, they do pay a lot for healthcare. Public education is poor in the country, and there's an ongoing concern for pension reform in the country, which Chileans have been protesting for a very long time. Back in 2016, there were almost 10,000 people who went out to the streets to protest for a pension reform system that was installed during the era of Pinochet. So the pensions are very low, and they would really want reform regarding this. Then we have a huge economic inequality in the country that has shaken lots of people. So the growing inequality has sharpened Chilean citizens because back in 2017, the number was only 39 times. There was a difference between households of 39 times higher between the richest household and the poorest household compared to 2008, where this number was only 30 times a difference. So a lot of Chileans are protesting a lot of things that just have to do with more than just the metro fare raise. This was just the tip of the iceberg for them.
Although we hear little about it because Colombia is a U.S. ally and weapons purchaser, people in Colombia are rebelling also. Here's journalist, filmmaker, novelist, and philosopher Andrei Vilcek talking about the situation there on a recent 21st Century Wire podcast.
In Colombia, it was expected and unexpected at the same time, because Colombia is another neoliberal stronghold like Chile. It was never as successful, of course, as Chile for the big business, because Colombia is known for its great disparities between the rich and poor. There is a civil war going on for many decades. Country is also known for drug cartels and for extremely brutal oppression of the popular uprisings and protests. The misery in Colombia is incredible. I worked there on many occasions, and although the West again is very much supportive of the government for many reasons, the social situation is just terrible. Colombia has been used by the United States. They are supposed to have the first NATO bases, believe it or not, on the territory of South America. Also, Colombia is used to intimidate neighboring Venezuela. And therefore, it has very good reputation in Washington, London, and other Western capitals. On the other hand, if you really analyze the situation there, the social situation particularly, and not to speak about the human rights that favorite human rights of the West, there is no country in the region where the human rights are being violated in such incredible on such an incredible level as in Colombia.
But those aren't the only kinds of protests going on in South America. Venezuela and Bolivia are experiencing revolts of the upper classes, the comprador elites, in partnership with the United States against the democratically elected governments in which the majority, the workers, have selected the leaders. In Venezuela, the attempted coup has so far failed, but in Bolivia, it has succeeded, and the elites, along with their U.S.-trained militaries and police, are violently suppressing demonstrators who want the president that they elected returned to office. Here's Andrei Vilchek again.
It was all set up. And what is very scary about being here in this continent, which was my home for many, many years, and I'm back here now, what is very scary is that there is absolute impotence when these things happen. What can we do? What are we going to do? Everybody knows that the coup was created by the US, that it was Organization of American States, which is controlled by Washington, actually lied. It provided false information. They overthrew democratically elected president, the greatest president probably on the territory, arguably after Chavez, in South America. But what are we going to do? And you see already things that I don't like to see at all. And even our allies like Lula yesterday spoke about, yes, it was a coup, it was terrible, but Evo should not have run for the fourth term, and it's very disturbing because this is besides the point. You see, the Constitution, they always say, well, Evo changed the Constitution, it was not really the good move, and so on. But what is Constitution? Constitution is a piece of paper which can be, which people can rewrite if they want to, if they like the leader that they have, if they really like the system which they have. Then Constitution is a secondary issue. It can be changed. It's not some kind of a religious document. It was changed. And now Evo is being accused of running for the fourth time. He won democratically elections, and people are holding against him, actually, that he was running for the fourth time, despite the fact that he got around 60% of the support in this. So this is democracy. It's a democracy according to Bolivian standards and culture and so on. Why should we stick to some kind of a democracy which is dictated from the West? But what we see now after what happened in Bolivia, as you said very correctly, and as your reports are showing, there was a coup. Everybody agrees there was a coup, but nobody can do anything, and nobody is willing to do anything, and that is the most actually horrifying thing. But what we have is a lack of solidarity, really, in Latin America. That has to definitely change, because people cannot. One country obviously cannot defeat the interventions from the north. You see, the issues that I know, I already noticed this in Ecuador when I was covering in Ecuador during the Korea presidency, and what I saw in Bolivia was the same thing. Korea and Evo made one great mistake, which was, of course, never made in Cuba or in Venezuela. They did not manage to inspire their military. Of course, the military in a country like Ecuador or Bolivia is corrupt. A lot of generals were trained in the United States. But these people, but the same situation was in Venezuela before Chavez came to power. So what Chavez did, and Cubans did, they inspired the military, because these are also human beings. They want money, they can get corrupt, but also if you really approach them and you say to them, look, this is much bigger than money. You are fighting for Patria Grande, you are fighting for South America, this, you can really inspire many of them. So after Chavez died or was killed or whatever, he left the military where it is now, and it stands besides Maduro. It supports Maduro no matter what, because they are on much bigger mission. In Ecuador, when I talked to the government officials of Korea, they were complaining even years ago. They said, look, it's a miracle that there is no coup against Korea yet, because the military is very much indecisive. They are with the West, they are with him, they are not sure where they stand. And in Bolivia, it was the same thing. Evo did incredible things for the continent. The empowerment of the indigenous people. I know the country 20, 30 years ago. It was a total basket case, racist. They treated indigenous people like animals. I couldn't even get my photographers to the decent cafe if they were not white. But what happened is Evo couldn't inspire the military, who many of them are actually indigenous folks too. He didn't inspire them in a way to say, look, I know that you have this history with the United States, but here we are building new South America. We are building South America for the indigenous people. We are rescuing our culture against the West, and people were raped, destroyed for centuries, and this could actually could be very important moment when the at least some generals would say, look, yes, we are going to divorce ourselves from the Western influence, and we are going to fight for our people, because they would feel that they are on some kind of a great mission. But Evo is a good, kind, decent human being. He was really fighting for better Bolivia. He didn't probably feel that it's necessary to deal too much with the military. But unfortunately, unless we have our back covered in South America by armed forces who are educated to understand what is actually happening during the process, during the revolution, then we are lost. And what happened in Bolivia is precisely that. Evo was betrayed by his own military. If the military would not go with the U.S. and the Organization of American States, we would not be in the situation in which we are right now.
Again, that was Andrei Vilcek speaking on a podcast of 21st Century Wire, which I strongly recommend. You're listening to Wider View, a weekly conversation with analysts and activists rarely found in the mainstream media. Wider View is made available free of charge to radio stations nationwide, and a podcast of this show is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play Music as Wider View Radio, and at widerviewradio.podbean.com. You can also follow us on Facebook at Wider View Radio. Before we leave the topic of Latin America, we must talk about Venezuela. Here are some excerpts from a February 2019 documentary by Al Jazeera English on the situation in Venezuela and U.S. involvement in that country. In this report, you will hear the voices of Miguel Tinker Salas, Venezuelan historian and professor at Pomona College, and Mark Weisbrot, economist and president of the think tank Just Foreign Policy.
What exactly is the U.S. up to in Venezuela? A New York Times report from 2018 claims that the Trump administration held secret meetings in 2017 with Venezuelan military officers to discuss their plans to overthrow President Nicolas Maduro. That would not have been the first time a U.S. administration has meddled in Venezuela's affairs. In fact, U.S. involvement in Venezuela dates back decades.
Well, it's not new. As the history record proves, the U.S. has sought regime change in Venezuela since the election of Hugo Chavez.
But you can't talk about U.S. intervention in Venezuela or even Latin America without mentioning a nearly 200-year-old policy called the Monroe Doctrine.
To put it simply, it basically declared that the United States had a kind of supremacy in this hemisphere.
Originally designed to block European powers claiming colonies in Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine was later interpreted to mean the U.S. also claimed the right to overrule the democratic process on the continent through invasions, coups, and CIA covert operations.
The United States is an empire, and so if you're an empire, you want as many countries as possible to line up with you. And so the pawns matter as well in a chess game.
In 2013, Secretary of State John Kerry announced the end of the Monroe Doctrine.
Many years ago, the United States dictated a policy that defined the hemisphere for many years after. We've moved past that era.
But how true is that statement?
It never ended. In terms of foreign policy, there is very little difference between liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans on the matter of exercise of U.S. foreign power in Latin America. We've had coups supported by Democrats and we've had coups supported by Republicans.
Venezuela also checks another key box of reasons for U.S. intervention: oil. Venezuela's petroleum production reached an all-time high in 1970. A few years later, in 1976, the industry was nationalized.
Venezuela has some of the largest deposits of oil in the world, and potentially that oil could be of great asset, as Mr. Bolton has said, if American companies are able to exploit it. Venezuela was always seen as a very willing ally and also as a constant supply of oil.
But beyond oil, the U.S. was desperate to prevent this former ally from becoming a socialist state.
Venezuela was the beginning of a radical political change in Latin America, beginning in 1998. Venezuela went from being the model democracy, the preferred option that the U.S. promoted in Latin America, a pacted democracy that always supported the U.S., to being its nemesis when the election of Hugo Chavez, who promoted regional integration, national sovereignty, nationalism, and an alternative to the U.S. promotion of free trade and neoliberalism in Latin America.
Hugo Chavez's election was particularly concerning for the U.S. He not only sought to use Venezuela's oil wealth to fund healthcare, education, and other benefits for the poor, but he also aligned with Cuba's Fidel Castro, Washington's longtime nemesis in Latin America.
So in that sense, Venezuela becomes a thorn in the side of the U.S., and you add to that the election of Chavez in Venezuela was quickly followed by Lula in Brazil, the Kirchners in Argentina, Correa in Ecuador, Morales in Bolivia, Bachelet in Chile. And you saw a change in the geopolitical character in the landscape of Latin America, and that's threatened the U.S.'s hegemony. So that what's happening now in many cases is an effort to recoup that hegemony. And Venezuela is part of that effort to recover the U.S.'s control and power.
In 2002, after 18 people were killed in an anti-government protest, Venezuelan military officers and opposition leaders staged a coup to overthrow President Chavez. U.S. government officials serving under George W. Bush at the time denied having any prior knowledge of the coup. While American officials said they would not support any extra-constitutional moves to oust Chavez,
there were CIA documents that were made public that showed that the United States government had advanced knowledge of the coup.
Intervention doesn't always rely on force. President Trump announced sanctions on Venezuela's state-run oil industry in an effort to press for change in the country.
What we're focusing on today is disconnecting the illegitimate Maduro regime from the sources of its revenues.
Well, I think that from the very beginning, the U.S. policy towards Venezuela has been one of isolating Venezuela. This was under the Bush, Obama, and now Trump administration. Venezuela depends on oil for about 95% of its export earnings. It takes oil profits, purchases food, brings it back to the country for sale. That means it can be easily intervened and can be easily upended. So sanctions means that the country no longer can, on many levels, be able to utilize its foreign assets to buy food and bring it home. Sanctions also means it can't renegotiate its debt. Sanction also means it can't buy on the international market.
After the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013, his former deputy Nicolas Maduro took power. Since then, Venezuela has been rocked by political, financial, and humanitarian crises. And ordinary Venezuelans are bearing the brunt of all of them. The country is facing hyperinflation, poverty, and food shortage. People are struggling to afford basic necessities, including medicine. 3 million Venezuelans have fled to neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil. While Maduro blames the U.S., critics, including many former supporters and officials of Hugo Chavez, blame corruption and poor governance. President Trump took advantage of the chaos and division in Venezuela to throw his support behind the self-declared interim president, Juan Guaido. Keep in mind that the U.S.'s involvement in Venezuela fits a long-term pattern of U.S. intervention in Latin American politics.
So you have a long history of U.S. intervention in the region, and it's very anti-democratic, very often supported dictatorships. And in the 21st century, it was mostly against these left governments who were more interested in independence and self-determination than the prior governments that were close to the U.S.
the Trump administration has now called on veteran foreign policy advisor Elliot Abrams to act as special envoy on Venezuela. Abrams certainly has experience in the region, but that experience has not necessarily been in promoting democracy. Throughout the 1980s, he was a key figure in organizing the Reagan administration's support for dictators and death squads in El Salvador, Guatemala, Panama, and Nicaragua. He pleaded guilty in 1991 to 2 counts of misdemeanor for withholding information from Congress about illegal U.S. funding for right-wing Nicaraguan paramilitaries, the Iran-Contra affair.
The selection of Elliot Abrams shows that it's very similar to what they were doing in the 1980s when they were trying to overthrow the elected government of Nicaragua. And there was so much resistance to it, by the way, in the United States, that the Reagan administration had to end up funding the Contras illegally with arms sales to Iran. This is the neocons like John Bolton coming back and just trying to do the same thing all over again.
So, is it possible to want change in Venezuela but oppose U.S. involvement in the country?
I agree there needs to be change in Venezuela, but the Venezuelans have to decide that. It's a very slippery slope when we go down having the U.S. become the arbiter of internal politics in any country.
That was a report from Al Jazeera English entitled Venezuelan Crisis, The Long History of U.S. Intervention. And in addition to the narrator, it contained the voices of Miguel Tinker Salas, Venezuelan historian, professor at Pomona College, and Mark Weisbrot, economist and president of the think tank Just Foreign Policy. I've designed this program to provide a look at many of the places in Latin America where there is popular unrest, both those where the protests are coming from workers frustrated with the free market neoliberal economic agendas of their nation's elite, and those protests stimulated by U.S.-based non-governmental organizations or NGOs and fostered by the U.S. State Department and U.S. military aid. It's important to distinguish between these 2 types of protests. Governments that impose neoliberal policies, specifically tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, paid for by cuts in vital government services for the poor and working classes, generate organic and justifiable protests from those hurt by their policies. Governments that attempt to correct the imbalances caused by these policies through nationalization of industry, improving housing, education, and healthcare for ordinary people, do sometimes make mistakes and fall prey to corruption. But those seeking to overthrow those governments are often not interested in correcting those mistakes or eliminating the corruption, but in benefiting from the corruption of the government at the expense of the working classes. We've been seeing neoliberalism migrate from being a regime imposed on other nations to one being imposed on us here in the U.S. The Trump administration, for example, enacted a huge reduction in taxes for the wealthy and is now removing food stamps from over 700,000 poor Americans, increasing hunger and homelessness in the wealthiest nation on earth. The views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station that you're listening to. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thank you for listening.